When a night shift janitor discovers a hidden genius inside himself, the world of robotics will never be the same. This is the unbelievable, pulse-pounding journey of a man who rose from the shadow sand, stepped into history.
Aurora is the embodiment of our shared vision. When we work together, human and machine, there are no limits to what we can achieve.
The night shift at Holston Industrial Labs had a way of swallowing sound, leaving only the hum of machines and the faint echo of distant generators to fill the vast metallic corridors. It was in this realm of dim lights and flickering monitors that Ravi Eichbell moved through his routine, pushing a mop bucket that squeaked softly against the polished concrete floor. To most employees, he was invisible Ghost the janitor who cleaned up after geniuses, the man who swept away metal shavings and wiped away fingerprints from machines that cost more than he earned in a year. But to Ravi, these silent nights held something extraordinary. As he walked past towering robotic arms frozen mid-motion, half-assembled drones lying like wounded birds on work tables, and screens glowing with streams of incomprehensible data, he felt a strange pull, an undercurrent of curiosity he never dared to voice aloud. It had started months earlier, quietly and unexpectedly, when he noticed a robotic arm failing during a calibration sequence. The engineers, exhausted and irritable, argued about faulty wiring and sensor delays before giving up for the night. Hours later, when the lab was empty, Ravi watched the machine try to run its diagnostics again. It jerked, repeated its error, and froze. He stood there, mop in hand, and whispered to the empty room, "It's trying the same thing over and over. It won't learn." That simple observation lit a fuse he could no longer extinguish. Night after night, Ravi paid attention. He noticed patterns the engineers missed, the way certain sensors reacted differently under low lighting, how motors overheated when the machines repeated unnecessary motions, how small coding errors created loops that no one bothered to fix. It was like watching brilliant minds overlook the simplest truths. While they focused on speed and complexity, Ravi saw something else: inefficiency, waste, blind spots, and beneath those observations, something deeper stirred a feeling he had buried for years. The remnants of childhood curiosity, when he used to dismantle old radios and fans, just to understand how they worked. Back then, people called him gifted, but life had its own plans, and hardship slowly closed the doors that once seemed open. Yet here, surrounded by machines far more advanced than anything he had touched before, that old spark returned. Every night, it grew a little brighter. Ravi's shift ended at dawn, but instead of going home to collapse into bed, he found himself lingering by the lab's back door, replaying every malfunction he had seen. He imagined alternate solutions, tiny fixes, smarter sequences, devices that could adjust themselves instead of waiting for human intervention. He could almost see the designs in his mind. Robots that didn't just execute commands, but learned from their mistakes. The thought electrified him, both thrilling and terrifying. Who was he to dream about building advanced robotics? He didn't have a degree. He didn't have money. All he had were observations, instinct, and a growing ache inside him whispering, "Try." That whisper became impossible to ignore. One night, after watching a prototype drone crash for the third time in the exact same way, something snapped inside Ravi, not in anger, but in determination. It wasn't just that the drone malfunctioned. It was the silence that followed. The engineers had left. The lab was empty, and yet this machine was still trying, still failing, still looping through the same doomed pattern. It reminded him painfully of his own life, repeating the same motions, trapped in the same cycle, unseen by the world. He stepped closer, studying the drone with narrowed eyes. Its sensors were dirty. Its left stabilizer was slightly misaligned. A tiny coding bug blinked on the screen beside it. "If you could just adjust yourself," he whispered, gently touching the frame, "you wouldn't keep crashing." The idea hit him like a shock. What if robots were taught to adapt? What if they could course correct on their own, learning with each failure the way humans did? That night, Ravi didn't go home. Instead, he sat in the lab's break room long after the sun rose, staring at the vending machine as if it held the answers to the universe. He wasn't a scientist, but he understood something no one else seemed to notice. Learning wasanti, obao complacidia, was about awareness self-correction, feedback, and machines had all the hardware they needed to do that. They only lacked the design. By the time his next shift began, Ravi had already made a decision that terrified him. He was going to build something of his own. Not a big machine, not a full robot, just a small experimenta prototype to prove the concept. He didn't know how long it would take, or how many times he would fail, but the spark inside him had grown into a flame, and he could no longer pretend it wasn't there. Over the next few weeks, his nights at the lab became more than work. They became fuel. Every malfunction, every error message, every frustrated sigh from the engineers added another log to the fire burning inside him. He memorized patterns, movements, and software quirks. He studied how the engineers calibrated sensors and wrote segments of code. He watched, silently, soaking in everything like a sponge. And when they left, he replayed their steps in his mind. His mop bucket might have been filled with water, but his mind was filling with ideas. Ideas that sharpened with each passing night. Ravi still walked the halls unseen, still emptied trash bins and swept floors. But something in his eyes had changed. He was no longer a man simply completing his shift. He was observing, analyzing, dreaming, and though no one else could hear it, a revolution was beginning in the footsteps of a janitor who was starting to realize he wasn't meant to remain invisible forever. The spark had been lit, and nothing in his life, nor the world of robotics, would ever be the same again. Ravi's garage sat behind his small rented house, like a forgotten relic. Its metal door rusted at the corners, and its concrete floor cracked from years of neglect. But tonight, it glowed with a newfound purpose. After the long night shifts at Halston Industrial Labs, when most people longed for sleep, Ravi stepped inside this cramped, dusty space and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Possibility. It smelled of old oil cans, scorched wires, and memory, the air thick with the quiet anticipation of creation. Under a single buzzing bulb, he had gathered every discarded part he could salvage from recycling bins, junkyards, and online giveaways. Broken motherboards, half-melted motors, tangled wiring, dented metal plates, aging servo controllers, and even the cracked casing of a toy robot someone had abandoned years ago. Most people would have seen a pile of trash, but to Ravi, these were seeds, raw fragments of potential that, with enough patience and ingenuity, could be shaped into something extraordinary. He sat on a rickety stool, hunched over his workbench, his fingers trembling not from exhaustion but from the weight of what he was attempting. He didn't have formal training. He didn't have advanced tools. What he did have was the stubborn belief that machines could be more than static scripts, that they could learn, adjust, evolve. At first, the process was agonizing. He stayed awake until the sun came up, soldering wires only to watch them snap, connecting circuits that sparked violently and sent him stumbling backward, rewriting lines of code that crashed every time he pressed run. His laptop, old and dented, whirred loudly as if protesting the stress he was putting it through. More nights than he could count, Ravi felt temptation creeping in, urging him to stop, to accept his life as it was, to bury his ambition before disappointment destroyed him. But every time that voice whispered, he pictured the robotic arm in the lab failing again and again without learning, and he remembered the hollow ache in his chest when he realized he and that machine were not so different. Just as it kept repeating its mistakes, he had spent years locked in a cycle that left no room for growth. That thought stirred something fierce inside him, something almost defiant. "No," he would murmur to himself, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not this time." And he pressed on. Weeks turned into a blur of trial and error. His fingers were blistered from handling overheated components. His eyes burned from staring at screens filled with code he barely understood. He watched tutorial videos late into the night, pausing and replaying them until he grasped even the smallest concept. He rewired sensors 3, sometimes 4 times, before they responded. He scavenged broken electronic toys from thrift shops and stripped them for gears, servos, and tiny motors. If something didn't work, he tore it apart and started again. Every failed prototype became a stepping stone, a lesson carved into his memory through persistence and frustration. Slowly, agonizingly, progress emerged. A sensor that once flickered erratically now stabilized. A motor that used to grind harshly began to turn with smoother movement. A simple script he wrote clunky, and an efficient finally executed without crashing. They were small victories, but each one felt monumental. Proof that he was inching closer to the impossible. One night, after nearly 20 hours awake, Ravi sat slumped over his workbench, his legs numb and his head pounding. He had attempted to integrate his learning algorithm into a tiny robotic base, nothing more than a small platform with wheels and a handful of sensors. The moment he pressed run, the system crashed again. Frustration surged through him like fire. He slammed his hands on the table, sending tools rattling to the floor, his vision blurred with defeat. Maybe he was foolish. Maybe genius belonged only to those with degrees in expensive labs. Who was he, a janitor, to believe he could build something groundbreaking? He buried his face in his hands as exhaustion and doubt crashed over him in waves. Minutes passed. Maybe hours. The world felt heavy, suffocating. But then, in the quiet, something shifted. It wasn't a sound or a thought, just a feeling, a reminder that he had already come farther than he ever believed he could. He lifted his head slowly, his breath steadying. "One more try," he whispered, the words fragile but determined. With trembling fingers, he rewrote the algorithm line by line, simplifying it, adjusting it, trusting his instincts more than the tutorials he had studied. When he finally hit run again, he held his breath. The robot twitched. Its wheels spun. It moved forward and stable at first, jerking side to side, but then it corrected itself. It detected the wall in front of it, halted, backed up, and turned. Ravi's eyes widened. He leaned in closer, barely daring to believe what he was seeing. The robot wasn't just following a script. It was adjusting, learning, reacting. It bumped into a box he had forgotten to clear away and, instead of freezing or repeating the collision, and navigated around it. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it over the hum of the motor. He covered his mouth with his hand as tears filled his eyes, not from sadness, but from sheer overwhelming awe. This was it. The proof he needed. The dream that had kept him awake through countless exhausted nights. The tiny robot wasn't perfect. Its movements were shaky, its reactions slow, its design crude, but it worked. For the first time in his life, Ravi felt a surge of triumph so powerful it made his knees weak. He sank onto the stool, laughing breathlessly as the robot completed another small loop around the garage. At that moment, in that dim, cluttered garage, a janitor had done the impossible. He had built a foundation, a spark of something revolutionary. A machine that could think, adjust, and improve without needing a human hand to correct it. He sat in the warm glow of the buzzing bulb, watching the robot move with childlike fascination, and he knew deep in his bones that this was only the beginning. The world outside had no idea what was coming, but in this forgotten little garage, surrounded by scraps and dreams, a new future was being born, and Ravi, the man no one noticed, was about to step onto a path that would change everything. Ravi never imagined that carrying a small, homemade robot in a cardboard shoebox could feel like walking into a battlefield. But as he stepped through the polished glass doors of the Crescent Venture Forum, his palms slick with sweat and his heart hammering against his ribs, that was exactly how it felt. The lobby bustled with brilliant young engineers in crisp suits, entrepreneurs with perfectly rehearsed pitches, and investors whose sharp eyes scanned the crowd like predators searching for the next big opportunity. In the midst of them, Ravi stood wearing the same plain shirt he wore during his night shifts at Halston Labs, clutching his box like it was the only thing keeping him from collapsing. He felt smaller with every passing second, almost swallowed whole by the glossy floors and towering banners that advertised innovation, brilliance, and dreams, backed by millions of dollars. None of which he had, but he kept moving, step by trembling step, reminding himself that what he held in this box wasn't just wires and metal. It was the proof that he wasn't just a janitor. It was the key to a future he refused to let slip away. Inside the presentation hall, he took a seat in the last row, hoping to blend into the shadows. But the hum of polished voices around him made his stomach twist. They spoke in the language of CEOs and engineers, tossing around terms Ravi had only learned through late-night tutorials. Their confidence cut the air like knives, each sentence a reminder of how different he was from them. He could feel their glances skim over him, some curious, others dismissive, before shifting away as if his presence was a mistake. The weight of their silent judgment pressed against him, but Ravi held his shoebox tighter, grounding himself in the truth he carried. No one else in that room had built a robot that could learn on its own. No one else had created something from scraps and sheer will. They had degrees. He had determination. And tonight, determination would have to be enough. When the moderator finally called his name, mispronouncing it slightly, Ravi felt the world tilt. His legs felt numb as he stood, climbed the steps to the stage, and placed the box carefully on the podium. Under the blinding stage lights, he could see the faces of the audience, the investors leaning back in their chairs, consultants whispering to each other, tech influencers scrolling on their phones. He swallowed hard, wishing he could hide behind something, anything. But there was nowhere left to retreat. "Hello," he began, his voice cracking slightly. "My name is Ravi Iqbal." A few eyebrows rose. Someone murmured, "Isn't he the janitor from Holston?" Heat burned his cheeks, but he forced himself to continue. I built something I believe can change how robots learn." Laughter rippled lightly through the room, polite but cruel. The kind of sound that said they had already made up their minds. Ravi's hands trembled as he opened the box, revealing the small robot sparrow and its wires tucked neatly, its frame polished to hide its humble origins. He placed it gently on the table and pressed the activation switch. For a moment, nothing happened. Ravi felt his heart drop into his stomach. Then the robot twitched one wheel turning, then the other. It rolled forward, paused as its sensors scanned the podium's edge, and adjusted its direction. A few heads in the audience lifted. The robot approached a stack of brochures that had been left on the podium, nudged them, then halted. It scanned again, circled the stack, and recalibrated its path. The murmurs died. Someone leaned forward. Another lifted their phone to record. Ravi swallowed, his confidence growing like a tiny flame. "Sparrow," he said, voice steadier, "learns from its environment. It adjusts on its own. No pre-programmed sequences, no manual recalibration. As if performing on cue, the robot approached the podium edge once more, this time much smoother, and turned away with a confident spin. Investors exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from amusement to intrigue. Then came the voice that would change everything. "How did you build this?" A woman stood near the front row, her posture sharp, her eyes focused not on the robot but on Ravi. Her presence radiated authority. Elena Marquez, one of the most respected venture capitalists in the room. Whispers spread instantly. Ravi hesitated, unsure whether the truth would make him look more foolish or more genuine. "I built it in my garage," he admitted softly. "From discarded parts, salvaged pieces. I wrote the learning code myself." The silence fell so heavy he could hear his own breath. Elena stepped closer to the stage. "Alone?" He nodded. The silence deepened, but this time it didn't feel hostile. It felt electric. Suspenseful, like the entire room was holding its breath. "What you've done," she said slowly, "shouldn't be possible under those conditions." Ravi's chest tightened, expecting doubt, dismissal, mockery, but instead, her lips curved into a small, stunned smile. "Which means it is extraordinary." The shift in the room was immediate. Investors leaned forward. Phones recorded. People scribbled notes. Questions erupted about scalability, about algorithm structure, about long-term application. Ravi answered what he could, stumbling through some explanations, but surprising himself with how freely others flowed. For the first time in his life, people weren't looking through him. They were seeing him. When the event ended, Elena approached him personally. She extended her hand, her eyes bright with excitement. "Ravi," she said, voice steady and warm, "I want to help you build this. Not just the robot, but whatever comes next." The words washed over him like sunlight breaking through clouds. No one had ever offered him anything like this. Not opportunity. Not belief. Not a chance to rise. He stared at her hand, then slowly reached out and shook it. In that moment, the world shifted beneath his feet. Something inside him clicked into place, as if a locked door had finally swung open after years of silent knocking. As he walked out of the building, shoes scuffing against the polished marble floors he once only cleaned. Ravi felt taller than he ever had. The night air outside felt cool and alive against his skin. He looked down at the shoebox, tucked under his arm the little machine that had changed everything. Sparrow One hummed softly, its sensors blinking like tiny eyes. Ravi smiled, feeling tears prick the back of his throat. For the first time, he truly believed he belonged in this world of innovators and dreamers. For the first time, he felt seen. He didn't know what challenges awaited him, or how steep the road to success would be. But one thing was certain. He was no longer walking in the shadows. He was stepping boldly into the light, and the world was finally watching. Success, Ravi learned quickly, was a strange kind of light bright enough to illuminate the path ahead, yet sharp enough to cast deep shadows behind him. In the days following the Crescent Venture Forum, his world transformed at a dizzying pace. Elena Marquez kept her promise, inviting him into the sleek, glass-walled offices of her innovation firm, Solstice Dynamics, where he was given a badge that actually bore his name and not the word maintenance. For the first time, he walked through corridors, not as an invisible worker sweeping corners, but as a member of something meaningful. Engineers greeted him with cautious curiosity. Interns whispered excitedly about the janitor genius, and journalists flooded his inbox, requesting interviews. But beneath the excitement, Ravi sensed the undercurrent of tension-silent scrutiny from seasoned developers, tight-lipped stares from those who had spent years building credentials he didn't have. To them, he wasn't a prodigy. He was an intruder, a fluke, a man without the right degrees or the right pedigree, threatening to disrupt an order they benefited from. And yet Elena pushed him forward, placing him in the heart of the company's R&D wing and insisting that he begin work on Sparrow 2. A more advanced successor that could prove the first robot wasn't just an accident, but the birth of a revolution. Late nights became early mornings, as Ravi dove into work, living on instant noodles, lukewarm tea, and the relentless fire of determination. The glass lab became his sanctuary. He would sit hunched over scraps of metal and circuit boards, wiring new sensory pathways, refining the adaptive learning algorithm, and running experiments that stretched into dawn. Elena visited frequently, her presence both motivating and intimidating. She would stand behind, arms folded, mind sharp as a blade, asking incisive questions about processing speed, memory, allocation, and long-term learning patterns. Sometimes Ravi answered with confidence. Other times he stumbled, painfully aware of the missing gaps in his self-taught education. But Elena showed patience, guiding him rather than judging, helping him decipher the complexities of machine learning he had once only glimpsed through blurry tutorial videos. With her guidance, Sparrow 2 began to take shape. Taller than its predecessor, equipped with advanced sensory nodes and a modular frame that could adapt to new attachments. For the first time, Ravi felt like an inventor, not one stealing moments in a dim garage, but one standing on the brink of something monumental. Yet the brighter his accomplishments glowed, the darker the eyes watching him from the shadows became. One pair of eyes in particular followed him with growing resentment. Dr. Marcus Halen, the head of Solstice's robotics division. Marcus was everything. Ravi was not polished, prestigious, with degrees from MIT and Stanford hanging over his office walls like trophies. He had spent years in the company, waiting for the chance to lead the next big breakthrough. Then Ravi walked in, armed with nothing but a shoebox robot, and overnight became the center of Elena's attention. Marcus rarely spoke to Ravi directly, but when he did, his words carried a subtle sting. Interesting approach, it would say, while inspecting Ravi's schematic sheets. Crude, but inventive. Or, I suppose even scrap metal can surprise us sometimes. Yet behind the veneer of politeness, Ravi sensed something colder, something dangerous. Marcus had the respect of the team, the trust of the executives, and most importantly, access to every corner of the company. A man with power, a man with pride, and Ravi's very existence was slowly unraveling both. One night, as rain lashed against the building's windows and thunder cracked the sky like an ancient curse, Ravi stayed late, working on Sparrow 2's neural adaptation system. The lab was empty, save for the soft hum of machines and the flickering glow of overhead lights. He adjusted a line of code, only to watch the system crash unexpectedly. Confused, He ran on the simulation. Crash again, he frowned, opening the back end. Logs and froze. Someone had altered the neural routing file. A small change. Almost invisible, but catastrophic when executed. His pulse quickened. He checked. The timestamp. The edit had been made earlier that day while he was out at a meeting with Elena. Panic sparked inside him. Who would tamper with his work? Why? He barely had time to breathe before the lab door opened and Marcus stepped in, his expression unreadable. "Still here?" Marcus asked, casually strolling through the room as though he owned every breath of air in it. Ravi nodded stiffly, trying to hide the trembling in his hands. "Good," Marcus continued, stopping beside Sparrow 2's frame. "Elena believes in you. She sees potential. I admit you possess, but potential is fragile, Ravi. One mistake, one failure, and the same people cheering for you will be the first to blame you." He turned, eyes narrowing. "Be careful." Then he walked out, his footsteps echoing ominously in the hallway. Ravi stared after him, heart racing, the implication hanging heavily in the room. Was Marcus warning him, threatening him, or simply reminding him how precarious his position truly was? Determined not to be sabotaged, Ravi backed up his files, restored the original code, and continued working through the night, exhaustion choking his thoughts. By morning, Sparrow 2's neural system was stable again, but the encounter with Marcus stayed with him, burrowing into his mind like a splinter. Something was terribly off. As they spaced, strange incidents increased. A missing component from his workstation. A corrupted file. A rumor circulating that Ravi had plagiarized code from Holston Labs. His confidence wavered. His hands shook when he worked. Sleep slipped further away each night. Yet Elena remained steadfast. She noticed the stress in his eyes, the quiet fear in his voice, and pulled him aside. "Listen, Ravi," she said firmly, her tone carrying the weight of absolute belief. "You are not here by accident. You earned your place. If someone is trying to undermine you, let me worry about them. You focus on the work." Her reassurance lit a spark of courage inside him. He wasn't alone. He wasn't powerless. And they, Walden, TB, intimidated back into the shadows. By the end of the week, Sparrow 2 finally stood complete sleek, adaptive machine ready for its first full demonstration. Ravi stared at it with a mix of pride and dread, knowing the next chapter of his journey would either cement his future or destroy everything he had built. But as he placed his trembling hand on the robot's shoulder, feeling the hum of its awakening circuits, he whispered to himself that he would face whatever came next with the same resolve that brought him this far, no matter who tried to stop him, no matter what shadows lingered behind the spotlight. Because he had stepped into a world of giant sand, he was no longer afraid to stand tall among them. Ravi never expected leadership to feel like standing on the edge of a cliff, balancing between triumph and collapse with every breath he took. Yet as Lumos Robotics evolved from a cramped R&D wing into a fast-growing technological force, he realized that innovation was only half. The battle-guiding people was the other. The day Sparrow 2 successfully completed its public demonstration, flawlessly reorganizing a chaotic factory setup while adapting in real time to unexpected obstacles. Lumos's future shifted like a tectonic plate snapping into place. Orders poured in from manufacturing plants, stores, logistics companies, even hospitals seeking smarter automation tools. Overnight, Ravi went from the quiet engineer who once swept floors in obscurity to the reluctant star of a booming enterprise. But success came with an avalanche of responsibilities. Hiring teams, negotiating contracts, presenting at investors' summits, and making decisions that affected hundreds of workers. While the world glorified the genius behind the machines, they didn't see the man spending sleepless nights pacing the new office floor, staring out at the city through glass windows that made him feel exposed and vulnerable. He didn't see himself as a CEO. He saw himself as the janitor who was still worried about breaking things, who still jumped when machinery sparked unexpectedly, who still remembered the weight of silence in empty hallways. The transition felt like trying to fit into clothing tailored for someone else too big, too stiff, too unlike him. Yet every time doubt clawed at him, he reminded himself of Elena's unwavering faith, the hungry look in young engineer's eyes, and the responsibility he now carried to build a world where people weren't crushed by automation, but elevated by it. Inside the bustling Lumos facility, Ravi began cultivating a leadership philosophy rooted in humility and compassion principles born from his years of invisibility. He insisted on hiring people not simply for their credentials, but for their capacity to imagine, fail, and rise again with unbroken determination. "A degree isn't a guarantee of brilliance," he said in meetings, "but curiosity is." Many executives balked at his unconventional approach. Marcus Halan especially seemed aggravated that Ravi was giving opportunities to technicians and self-taught coders. Yet Ravi refused to bend. He remembered the sting of being underestimated, of being seen as less than capable simply because of a job title. He vowed that Lumos would be a sanctuary for anyone with the fire to create. Soon, the workspace filled with eclectic minds, brilliant college graduates working beside former factory workers who tinkered as children, seasoned programmers collaborating with young hobbyists who had grown up repairing radios with their fathers. Innovation bloomed from unexpected corners, and Ravi watched with pride as prototypes evolved faster than he could have dreamed. Still, with growth came conflict. Teams clashed over design philosophies, deadlines slipped, and disagreements sometimes erupted into heated debates. In those moments, Ravi stepped into a role he never imagined, mediating disputes with surprising empathy, pulling people into late-night meetings where he explained how failure was not a shameful end, but an essential stepping stone. Slowly, he earned a new kind of respect, not built on fear or hierarchy, but on trust. As Lumos expanded, so did the scrutiny. Critics accused the company of accelerating job displacement, claiming Ravi's robots would replace the very workers he once stood beside. The headlines grew harsh: Lumos Robotics, helping or hurting the working class. Janitor turned inventor sparks automation, panic. Ravi read them with a heavy heart. It was the same fear he had once felt, standing before the robotic arm that nearly hit him during his janitorial shift. But he refused to let Lumos become the villain in the story he wanted to rewrite. So he launched the Lumos Learning Initiative, a free training program that taught workers how to operate, maintain, and even co-design robotics systems. He partnered with community centers, vocational institutes, and small factories, offering hands-on workshops and online courses. People who had once feared losing their livelihoods walked into training rooms, anxious and defensive, but walked out empowered. Ravi attended many of these sessions personally, sometimes rolling up his sleeves to demonstrate a wiring fix or guiding someone through coding a sensor loop. These moments grounded him, reminding him of the garage days, the spark that first ignited his journey. The press eventually shifted their tone, praising Lumos for taking ethical steps that other tech giants had ignored. But Ravi didn't do it for the applause. He did it because he understood what it meant to be overlooked, forgotten, and afraid of the future. He wanted his company to promise something different, that technology could uplift rather than discard. Still, leadership came with threats, not easily solved by empathy. Marcus, who had tolerated Ravi's rise with simmering irritability, now saw his influence diminishing. While others adapted to Lumos's shifting culture, Marcus clung to old hierarchies and rigid beliefs. Their meetings grew colder, their conversations strained. Elena noticed the tension, sometimes stepping in to redirect heated discussions. But Ravi sensed that Marcus's discontent ran deeper than professional disagreement. The man who once subtly sabotaged Ravi's code had not forgotten what he lost to the day. Sparrow once stole the spotlight. In quiet moments, Ravi felt Marcus's presence like a storm cloud looming overhead. Yet he refused to let rivalry corrupt his vision. He focused instead on the future Lumos's next breakthrough, the Aurora unit, a collaborative robot designed not to replace human workers, but to amplify their abilities, working beside them like a partner rather than a superior. The project became a symbol of everything Ravi believed in. He poured himself into it, spending countless nights refining its design, adjusting its emotional recognition system, teaching it to interpret tone, posture, and stress levels. He wanted Aurora to understand people, not just tasks. The unveiling of the Aurora prototype marked a defining moment for Lumos. In a packed auditorium buzzing with journalists, factory owners, students, and skeptics, Ravi stepped onto the stage not as the nervous, awkward innovator he once was, but as a leader shaped by struggle, empathy, and conviction. He spoke from the heart, telling the audience that automation should not erase humanity, but elevate it. Then, in a breathtaking demonstration, Aurora worked seamlessly beside human volunteers, anticipating their movements, offering assistance, even adapting its workflow to match their pace. The crowd erupted into applause. Cameras flashed. Interviews piled up. But more importantly, workers across industries saw a hopeful future, one where they weren't left behind, but carried forward by technology built with them in mind. As the applause faded and Ravi stood backstage catching his breath, Elena approached with a look of pride and relief. "You've done more than build machines," she said softly. "You've built a movement." Ravi felt the truth of her words settle deep within him. He wasn't the janitor scrambling to survive in a world that overlooked him. He wasn't just the inventor tinkering in a garage. He was the heart of a company rewriting the meaning of progress, and he was only getting started. Years later, long after the first prototypes had become global standards, after Lumos Robotics had risen from a daring startup to a world-shaping technological titan, Ravi often found himself wandering the quiet hallways of the company's headquarters at dawn, when the building was still asleep and the world outside glowed with the pale light of possibility. He still preferred these early hours, the hush before the day swallowed him whole, the moments that reminded him of those lonely nights at Halston Labs when everything began. The headquarters was a marvel of glass, steel, and greenery, a place where automated systems worked in harmony with human specialists, where innovation thrived not at the expense of people, but because of them. Yet Ravi always drifted toward the same corner of the lobby, where a simple framed photograph hung almost unnoticed amid sleek holographic displays. It was an old picture. Him in dingy janitor overalls, mop in hand, standing in the dim industrial corridor where Sparrow One had been born. Visitors often asked why such an ordinary, unflattering image held a place in a space filled with technological brilliance. But to Ravi, it was everything. It was his anchor, his reminder, his truth. Every morning, he paused before it, not to admire how far he had come, but to remember that greatness rarely starts with applause, starts in the shadows, with quiet choices made when no one is watching. As time passed, the world began calling Ravi Iqbal a visionary, a pioneer, a symbol of the new age of ethical automation. Universities quoted his principles, governments consulted him for policies, aspiring inventors, workers, students, dreamers all looked to him not just for innovation, but for hope. And Lumos itself had become a global force for change, spreading collaborative robotics and human-centered AI across continents. The Aurora units, once experimental machines, now worked in hospitals assisting fatigued nurses, in disaster zones mapping safe passages, in classrooms helping children with special learning needs, and in elderly care centers offering companionship and support. Everywhere they went, they carried a piece of Rovis's belief: technology must listen to the human heart before it serves the human hand. Yet for every success, Ravi knew the journey had been paved with sacrifices. There had been nights he slept on office couches, days he drowned in pressure, and battles he fought not against machines, but against powerful individuals who doubted or feared him. Marcus Island, the man who once tried to sabotage him, eventually left Solstice Dynamics under investigation for unethical practices. For a time, Ravi thought Marcus's bitterness would haunt him forever, a ghost of insecurity he could never escape. But as years softened wounds, Ravi came to understand that Marcus had been a teacher in his own grim way. Without that opposition, without those painful moments of doubt, Ravi might never have learned resilience, vigilance, or the courage to stand firm when the ground beneath him trembled. One of Ravi's proudest decisions was establishing the Lumos Human Innovation Trust, an international foundation dedicated to providing technological education and ethical training to underserved communities. Children who had never touched a computer before were learning to build robots. Older workers who feared obsolescence were discovering new careers in machine learning, supervision, and robotic maintenance. Ravi visited these programs often, sometimes slipping in unannounced, sometimes sitting quietly at the back of the room watching faces light with discovery. Those moments nourished him more deeply than any award or business accolade. He saw in their eyes what he had once carried in his own, the fragile spark of possibility, and he nurtured it, gently, as if tending a flame that could someday grow into its own blazing legacy. But the moment that would stay with Ravi forever came during a global summit on the future of robotics and humanity. The stage was grand, with world leaders, industry giants, and thousands of attendees watching. After delivering a powerful address about the moral responsibilities of innovation, Ravi stepped back, preparing to leave the stage, when a young girl Bareli Toi stood up in the audience. She lifted a small, handmade robot above her head and shouted, voice trembling with emotion, "I built this because of you." The room fell silent. Ravi froze. The girl continued, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Everyone told me I was too young, too small, too ordinary. But then I watched a video about a janitor who became a robotics inventor. And I thought, if he could do it, maybe I can too." The audience erupted into applause, but Ravi didn't hear any of it. His heart cracked open in the most beautiful way. In Tatshield and her trembling hope, he saw the full meaning of his journey. It had never been about machines. It had never been about Lumos, or the fame, or the global recognition. It had always been about this sparking courage in others, inspiring belief where none existed before. When the summit ended and the world moved on to its next headline, Ravi walked alone through the quiet nighttime streets, breathing the cold air as if it were medicine. The city around him shimmered with lights. Drones hummed through the sky. Automated taxis glided along smooth roads, all touched, in some way, by the ideas he had once scribbled in a garage lit by a flickering bulb. And yet he felt no pride, only gratitude. Gratitude for the janitorial job that taught him humility, for the loneliness that carved clarity inside him, for the failures that burned, for the mentors who lifted him, and even for the adversaries who sharpened him. Life, he realized, had not given him a straight path, but a mosaic of experiences that made him whole. In his final years as CEO, Ravi began shifting more responsibility to the next generation of leaders at Loom, choosing those who shared his heart-driven philosophy rather than the loudest or most brilliant voices. He believed deeply that one person should never hold the future hostage, not even someone who built the system. And so, step by steady step, he prepared the world to continue without him at its helm. When he finally stepped down, the world celebrated, but he simply smiled and returned to the quiet places he loved: community centers, training halls, small workshops, humming with creativity. That was where he belonged, not on stages, but among dreamers. On the last evening of his final day at Lumos headquarters, Ravi stood once more before the old photograph in the lobby. The janitor with a mop stared back at him, tired, unnoticed, but burning with untold potential. Ravi touched the frame gently and whispered, "You did it. We did it." Then, with a soft breath, "Turn it, Hawaii, not toward an ending, but toward a new beginning. Because the true legacy of a visionary isn't the empire he builds. It's the courage he ignites in the hearts of those who follow. If stories of grit, heart, and unbelievable transformation inspire you, then you're in the right place." Subscribe to Drew Daily Stories for more jaw-dropping journeys, real-life legends, and cinematic dailies that remind us that anyone anywhere can rise above everything. Don't just watch the story. Become a part of it.